Hi, in this video I'll be looking at how to implement security in a data model. For this example, I've created a cut-down database to better illustrate how to implement row-level security. First of all, let's have a look at the purchase order table in this example. You can see that the purchase order table has a purchase order ID, and it also has employee ID and other details. What we'd like to do is when a user logs in, we'd like to restrict them to just the purchase orders that they've created. You can see if I execute this that the employee ID column contains various IDs. So we'd like to restrict them just to their ID with a where clause. To get the ID for the user, we need to go to the user table in this example. Let's have a look at the user table. You can see that it contains the ID for the user and then a user-friendly description of the user and other attributes. For Sharperlight to implement security, the first thing we need to do is map the user account that Sharperlight logs in as to the user account in this particular system. And that's done in Site Setup. Let's have a look at Site Setup. You notice that the users don't need to correspond to the users in that particular system. This is because it's implementing a federated security system where we log in with a Windows account, for example, and then depending on the product, in this case it's Sharperlight example, we can implement a mapping. If I click on the lookup for the mapping, you can see it's displayed the details from that user table. And from this list you can then select a particular user. This is called user mapping. So when the data model then starts up, we can then convert this name into an ID. Let's have a look at the data model and how to implement this user mapping lookup list. In the data model, select the product and then double click on users. This is where we implement the interface to the user details. By default, this will be disabled, so we need to come in and set the users to visible. Then come into the table and put in the table name for the table that's going to display the users. Next, where you do have the details, enable each column and provide the correct column name. In this case, it's user code. And for the description, I've actually combined two columns together, so I've combined their first name and last name to give a unique title. I didn't have a group, so I disabled that, and I did have email, password and some attributes. In this case I put the employee ID into the attributes. But essentially the most important part is this user code. If this is implemented correctly, Site Setup will then display a lookup. Next step is to go to processes. And you can see here we have various events that will run when the data model starts up. The important one to look at here is the OnUserLogon event. In this event, what we want to do is take the user mapping, if it's done, and find out what their corresponding employee ID is. Let's have a look at the first SQL statement in this list. To create this, I've used the new SQL state value. What this does is runs a SQL statement and then creates a state value in memory. Let's have a look at the syntax. You can see we have an if statement here, and then it checks to see if we've got user mapping enabled or not. Next, if the user mapping has been done, we try and find out the ID for that particular user map. So it's going to take that person's name and then bring back the employee ID and place it in a state value called user ID. If the user mapping is not enabled, we're just going to create an empty slot, which is an ID of -1. If a user mapping is invalid because someone's put in the wrong details or they've changed the connection to the database, it's possible that this will not be found and no user ID mapping is loaded into memory. For that reason, the second entry checks to see if this user ID exists. And if it doesn't exist, well, that means it's a invalid user mapping. So we're going to put in possible user ID of -2. If you're curious as to where these came from, you can come into control tags, and there's various categories for the control tags, but I found the user mapping control tags under user details, user mapping. You can see here that we've got the user security enabled and also the user map code. As for whether a state value existed or not, I used this one here, which is return 1 if a state value exists, otherwise 0. And for the if statement, I used the flow control. You can see there's various templates here. With state values, basically what happens is the engine will resolve these at runtime, and it'll reduce down to a simple SQL statement. So we'll have the username populated in here, and then it would execute the SQL statement, giving us the correct ID. So when a user logs on, we're reading into memory just for that particular user, their user ID. Next, we need to apply that to the table. So let's switch across to the table view and double click on purchase orders. Here's the purchase order table, and if we have a look at the properties for the table, you can see that in the where clause we have a bit of syntax. Let's have a look at that syntax. Again, it's saying that if there's user mapping enabled, what we're going to do is take the employee ID column and we're going to ensure that it's the same as the user ID that we resolved at the time of logon. In this way, we'll restrict the user just to their own purchase orders, and there's no way for them to get around this. Even if the user joined to the purchase orders from another table, this where clause is still going to kick in. This is because we put the where clause in where clause instead of where root clause. There's also options for doing joins as well, but in this example we'll just focus on a simple where clause. Okay, I'm going to log in now with a particular account and we'll see how the security kicks in. So I've logged in as Ivan R. And if I switch to the Sharperlight example and select information, you can see the details about which user account I'm mapped to. So in site setup, I've mapped this particular user to Hagen SE. If I went to another system, for example Dynamics GP, and went to information, you can see that I'm logged to a user called SA. So with this one account, I can impersonate different security systems in the various data models. Okay, let's go to the purchase order table, and if I output all the columns and preview the data, you can see that the employee ID is restricted to just 244. And if we go to information SQL statement, you can see here that a where clause has been injected to restrict us to just 244. To view what's happening in memory, let's come back to the product and right click on this example and select debug. And from there you can come to the state values. Up here you have the global state values that are applicable to everything in the data model, and in here you've got the user state values. These are the ones that are read in on that user logon event, and you can see that it's resolved this particular user mapping to account 244. Let's come back to site setup and have a look at some of the options that are available for user mapping. You can see that this account has a group policy for the user profile. So if we did user mapping, it would be anyone who belongs to this group would be logged in as this account. But on occasions, you want to fine-tune the user mapping by saying, for example, for this particular user, we'd like to have group policies except for this particular product, and then we can do the mapping accordingly. Or we could say for this particular user we'd like the group policy, but when it comes to user mapping we'd like to give them a particular user to impersonate. In this way we can go from very fine details and settings for that particular account right up to a group policy but with a particular user mapping. There are many ways to do security in data models. This is just one example. In other systems it may be necessary to do an inner join, for example, to lock down which rows the user can see, or it may be simply a matter of hiding folders based on the user's credentials. That's been a brief overview of row-level security in Studio.